the dream's over. In 1971,
music said something.
The revolution will not be televised.
The world was changing.
We were creating the 21st century in 1971.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. I'm back again with Ian. We're going to be discussing a documentary called 1971, the year that music changed everything. And I'll go into my criticism of that kind of mindset, by the way. Is it just a pet peeve of mine? But at the same time, I think the quality of the documentary is really good. And this filmmaker, by the way, I was already interested in this documentary because the director, the main creative force, I think, behind the documentary is Asif Kapadia. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that name correctly, but I've been a fan of his work. He directed a documentary called Senna, which is about a motocross racer who's like the most famous racer in the world, who died in a car accident in Brazil back in the 1970s. And it's an incredible documentary. I think it's available on Amazon Prime. And then he followed that up with, I think he won an Academy Award for the Amy Winehouse documentary called Amy, which is also incredible. It's really, really, and what is telling in both of those documentaries, especially the Amy documentary, is this archive footage that he somehow finds. And I think that it pays off here too. In this 1971, there are, these are stories that you, as any kind of music fan, you've heard these stories before, but some of this archive footage, I have not seen such intimate footage, before.
Yeah, I would say that's cool. I didn't know the director's previous work. I didn't look into that. I just went into it after forking over $4.99 to Apple TV.
I'm going to try to watch the rest of this during the 7-day trial period. Yeah. But now I have a friend of mine who wants to he loves the Ted Lasso show, and he wants to do the next season of Ted Lasso, record a podcast about it, which starts later this month. So I may have to hang in for at least for a little while longer. So.
But yeah, I mean, that is definitely one of the things. They have a lot of behind the scenes footage or news clips even. The first episode really is kind of broad. It's good. It sets the table. And, you have all these really crazy things going on in American society. Everybody's totally sick of Vietnam at this point. You have all the Nixon shenanigans, COINTELPRO, on and on, really. In the midst of that, you have, like we touched on, the Beatles officially broke up, and
yep.
We're getting, the Imagine album from John, and then What's Going On by Marvin Gaye. I mean, that's really the kind of thesis statement, I think, of the first.
Yeah, it's amazing to me, like you mentioned. First of all, the thing I'd like to mention is I had an argument on Father's Day with somebody about, they basically were claiming that, and we have such short memories. And that's what I was trying to drive home, that I think we have a very short historical memory. And they were trying to say that things literally have never been worse. And I say, believe it or not, I mean, there's always room for improvement. But I think it's very easy to kind of say, if things are worse today than they were a year ago or 9 months ago or whatever, it's very easy to say that, it's catastrophic. But all you need to do to kind of get your head around where things are at, even with issues with the previous administration and everything that I have, but you just have to go back and look at this war, right? And we talk about the culture war today. Think about the culture war back then, where you have these young men that are, tens of thousands of them. I mean, when you adjust for population, you're talking about over 100,000 dead between Vietnam War and the Korean War. You're well over 100,000, right? And if you take that into account, the size of the population, it would be, much worse than, for example, that population got hit by COVID, let's say. And you have a situation where those people are being sent off to war. There's a draft in the case of the Vietnam War. And there's this cultural divide where, Nixon, people forget this, Nixon, until Watergate, until he actually steps down from office, is very, very popular. He has a huge he has he won overwhelmingly the re-election. So he is massively popular. And yet, not when you look at generationally, there is a huge culture divide between the silent majority, as he called his following himself, and he basically diminished these protesters, saying like, yeah, they're very loud, but they're a sliver of the population. But that sliver of the population was making art and very transformative art at this time, right? Whether it's the movies that come out of the late 60s and early 70s, or it's the music. And before I want to pass it back to you, but just really briefly, just to set the table once again, I just want to call out just some of the albums that came out this year, just kind of to set that up. But you already touched on it. Imagine by John Lennon comes out this year. Let's Stay Together by Al Green. If you're a big fan of that album, that's probably his greatest album. You have Young, Gifted in Black by Aretha Franklin. You have Shaft, the Shaft soundtrack, which is influential, especially for disco music, by the way, very, very influential for disco. You have What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, maybe the greatest album that came out that year out of many. We have Nilsson Schmilsson, which we already discussed in the previous podcast, and it goes on and on. Bob Marley puts out his first album. The Rolling Stones and The Who put out one of their best albums. Janis Joplin puts out a great album. Carole King puts out Tapestry. Joni Mitchell puts out Blue. This is a crazy, crazy year. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's many others that, oh my God, Maggie May, right? Rod Stewart, we just bashed him in the previous podcast. Maggie May is a great album, right? Every Picture Tells a Story, I should say. It's a great album. And Maggie May, of course, from there. Oh my God, T-Rex. I forgot about T-Rex. It just goes on and on. The list just goes on and on.
Bowie, Bluesmaker.
Of course.
Yeah, no, it is insane to look at it from that perspective too, because it's not just oh wow, there's like a myriad of different things going on in the pop charts. These are artists that now we're around 50 years later,
right,
are all kind of cultural touchstones.
Exactly.
It really sparked for a lot of that in 71. The Beatles already had obviously like a crazy career, but then the kind of fracturing of them and then seeing them go off in different directions really started rolling around 71, 70. I looked at that too, like, All Things Must Pass was late 1970.
Right.
Almost,
right.
You can put that, you can almost roll that in.
Well, that would be my criticism of this. It's and it's a general criticism I have, and I'm going to throw this out there because I definitely want to have a devil's advocate type episode with you at some point in the future. And the thesis of that episode is going to be the Beatles are overrated. And I say that, by the way, as a huge Beatles fan, right? I love the Beatles, but I do want to put that out there. And the reason I mention that is I think it also ties in with kind of my perspective on history, where I feel that we have this need, especially in the United States, but in general, to have this theory of like the great man, right? So whereas I think that oftentimes it's more about like the telephone probably would have been invented by someone else if it hadn't been invented by Alexander Bell. As a matter of fact, it was copywritten by, on the same date, basically, patented, I should say, on the same date by two different inventors, right? And it's just like kind of the luck of the draw. So basically it gets to a certain point, things are happening and then they kind of coalesce. And the reason I mentioned that is some of the things you're talking about. It's very easy to say, can you believe 1971? And it is shocking to just see it. I totally agree. But I could say the same thing about 68. I could say the same thing about 75, 76, right? So there is like a good 8-year window where, but to that point, there is a lot of stuff happening, right? There's fracturing of society, right? And we're starting to see these kind of, and we don't see that kind of coalescing again of trying to have a cohesive single culture again until like the 80s, which doesn't last very long at all, by the way. Yeah. But I think that so anyway, I think it even though I kind of disagree with that perspective that 71 somehow changed music when you can really just move the frame a little bit and see almost the same thing, but it gives you an excuse to talk about all these things that are happening, right? So yeah,
it's pure framing. I mean, it is kind of conscious. It's like, oh, it changed everything. That
exactly.
Was it January 1st, 1971?
Exactly. Come
out till October of that year. So when did most people hear him? Probably 1972 at that point. I don't know.
And they cheat a little bit here. Even, I mean, they play what's that Iggy Pop song? This is in a later episode, and I'm just getting this. I haven't seen the episode yet, but I've seen the playlist, and they play like and they also have like a Bob Dylan song that was recorded in both cases. They're recorded in 1971, but they're not even released until like the mid 70s, right? So they're really cheating there to kind of, you know, I mean, if you go by when you record something, then some of these songs should be like 69, right? And then if you go by when they're, you know, so it's all, but what, like I said, you know, if you squint, it still is undeniable that there is an incredible amount of great music coming out at this point.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You got to kind of just take it like, all right, they need to put it in some sort of framework.
Right.
And, you know, for the most part, I mean, it really is like a pivotal year outside of the arts, but
right.
the way they reflected it is one of the most notable aspects. You know, I mean, I think the whole Marvin Gaye thing, what's going on, being the real kind of keystone or centerpiece of, or starting point of this documentary, and how they frame it is because, you know, that's a real interesting demonstration, kind of like a generational split that was really going on, because you had Marvin being part of the Motown, you know, assembly line, an awesome creative assembly line, but, you know, nonetheless, you know, Barry Gordy had set up a system, and it didn't involve protest songs or social music or anything of that sort. And Marvin was the first one really to break that mold completely, and that opened the floodgates, in my opinion, for Stevie Wonder.
Yes.
We also had a cool record release this year, not one of like the canon ones that people usually mention. It's outside of the talking book, but good record nonetheless. And you could kind of see already there was some drift in his subject matter or production styles. That was something that Marvin Gaye like really kicked down the door in for Motown artists.
And that's kind of what shocks me when you think about that is, like, for example, how you know, him releasing What's Going On was considered controversial even by Barry Gordy, because he didn't want to mess up his brand, which was, you know, pop music. And of course he'd become massively popular by having this kind of black music that was palatable to white audiences, right? The audience was mostly white, right? And so it's massively successful, and he's afraid of, and instead, of course, the record is massively, sells huge amounts, right?
Don't punish me with brutality. Talk to me so you can see what's going on. What's going on? Yeah, what's going on? Oh, what's going on? Right.
And then the Stevie Wonder albums come out, and some of those records are the absolute best-selling records of the 70s, right? Until you get to those kind of mega albums of, like, you know, Rumors and some of these other records. But until that happens, I mean, these albums sold like 5-6 million copies. I think What's Going On has sold, I mean, this is over time, but they've sold over 10 million copies. I think at least one of those Stevie Wonder albums has also gone over 10 million. But you think about, like, that was unheard of, you know, other than the Beatles, let's say, other than the Beatles, it was unheard of for anyone to sell that number of albums. I mean, people bought singles, people didn't really buy albums. Until probably until the Beatles and then the 70s. So it's just so funny that these things that they're like, you know, this will be commercial suicide, and then it's like there's a huge appetite for it, and this happens so often, right, where everybody thinks they know what the market wants, and then they're totally wrong, right?
I have not money, we make it, for we see it, you take it. Oh, way they do my life, yeah. Made me wanna holler the way they do my life.
Yeah, and you know, usually the common denominator there is that the people that think they know what the market wants are the people that have reaped the success of previous.
Of course, they want to maintain the system as is, right? Absolutely.
You know, I don't want to think too much and like change my approach at all, so it should be the same, and I'll keep doing well, you know. But that's definitely not how it works.
And even more so now, right? Like, you think about the rise of corporatism, you know, which has kind of been disrupted by these internet, like the internet itself has disrupted a lot of these things. But in the 80s, we touched a little bit on that last episode, but like in the 80s, everything became very corporatized, right? And it was successful for the country, right? The country's economy started to grow for the first time in a long time. The 70s were, you know, a stagnant time for growth in the US, and the 80s were kind of a boom time. But everything got corporatized to that point, like you were saying, where, you know, everything became a formula, and everybody's just kind of looking at what the formula is to make the same movie every time, and the same album every time, and the same song over and over again. And But this is still, that's what's kind of interesting about this time period of time. You come from, the culture is really directly tied into the music that you're hearing, because there is no formula yet, right? We haven't come up with the formulas yet, right? People are still just doing whatever. And, Jimmy Page, and I mean, all the rock gods, but, Jimi Hendrix, I meant to say, actually, Jimi Hendrix is like, having this, I mean, you think about that music now because it's so, whether not punk rock, which never really became that famous, but Jimi Hendrix has #1 records. And honestly, you look at, that's some pretty antisocial music, right? Like you think about what was popular at the time. This is not making any kind of commercial play, and these records are going to #1. The Doors, another example of someone who's like intentionally antisocial, who's having #1 records, right?
Aggressive, yeah. And yeah, it's interesting, and they kind of do touch on some of that stuff too, where there's always kind of a somewhat reactionary split, or it's the act of rebellion that it's basically kind of a rite of passage for everybody. That kind of does play out in these like broader societal trends. And the interesting part of this particular era, everybody that was real like champion of like the hippie movement or flower power or whatever were finally like hitting their 30s,
right?
And kind of getting burnt out on other stuff, and it was just like an end of a childhood period of a generation that's kind of been like maybe over idealized,
yeah,
in popular culture, but is it's definitely a force of popular culture.
I think this was interesting to see to see some of the music that did come out here, even the stuff that they get into in this documentary. But you obviously have Marvin Gaye's album, which is overtly political. You have Imagine, from John Lennon, which is overtly political. You have George Harrison's album, which is overtly political, but still the end of that flower generation. Like, it's not it's still kind of clinging to the old recipe, right? It's like, give peace a chance, right? And
My sweet Lord, my Lord, my Lord, I really want to see you, really want to be with you.
as is Lennon, although Lennon's starting to sour on it. You hear him. What's the song where he actually calls out? It's actually in the documentary. Oh no, it's when he's in Times Square, right? And he tells everybody to he goes, so what? Flower power didn't work. He goes, it's okay. We'll start over with something else, right?
And then also, yeah, also Imagine, being kind of a really broad utopian kind of. And I think he mentioned this. He was kind of writing it almost like a child song.
Right, right. Yeah, he calls Imagine like a kid's like a lullaby, right?
Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for. And no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You.
Like universal, but then on the same record you have songs like Crippled Inside, but then also they showed in the documentary How Do You Sleep,
Yeah.
Which is one of the first diss tracks that I could ever recall, because it's clearly directed at Paul McCartney.
Right.
And that's outside of hip hop, so that's pretty that's notable.
Yeah.
Like really shot across the bow. And it didn't come out till 73, but the McCartney song from actually Wings, Band on the Run, Let Me Roll It, is kind of, in my opinion, a shot back at John. But
I'll have to excerpt that when I put it together. But what I was going to say though about all of this potential rebellious music, especially considering it actually surprises me that other than culturally, that there is subtext in the culture splitting up into all these different genres. And there's the obvious political stuff like what's going on and Imagine. what actually surprised me in looking at all this music is that a lot of it's very experimental. You see reggae emerging. You see like Can, right? Like Can, which is I had not heard that album, that which is maybe the most famous album, but I knew them from that other, what's that? They're like kind of like they're more proto punk stuff that came later. But that was actually a really interesting album. And they're, it's almost like jazz at that point, right? So they are kind of merging jazz and folk and some other influences together. So that's all really interesting, but it's not political, right? It's experimental, but it's not really political. And as a matter of fact, a lot of this great music here, I don't see as being political at all. You see, well, maybe the Who is being political with, Teenage Wasteland, and they're all wasted,
Yeah.
I don't need to be forgiven.
But like, you look at Elton John, which, has one of his best albums here, and that's not political. And if anything's political, it's pure subtext. It's this emergence of these female performers, right? Like you have these women coming and writing their own stories, right? And whether that's Aretha Franklin or whether that's Joni Mitchell, of course, or Carole King. So it's like you have this emergence of these female performers that are telling, writing their own songs and telling their own stories. But once again, that's not overtly political, right? It's subtextually political. But yeah, I was expecting, if anything, I was expecting there'd be more, there'd be more open protest music, right?
Yeah, like I don't know. That was the thing. It seemed that energy really got wrung out. That type of protest folk music was, that was like the mid '60s stuff.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's strange that now, at the height of the protest movement in the streets, let's say, that you're right. I think that, the culture has kind of said, okay, we're done with that. Right. And it's like, they're kind of, and honestly, maybe this is a bigger theme, but I think maybe this is and actually Adam Curtis, right, talks about this, that maybe this is the emergence of politics being personal, right? It's like about self-actualization rather than political movements. So maybe it starts here too, because to your point, we have the end of like the hippie movement. And now what you have a lot of in the 70s is a lot of like singer-songwriter type music that gets very popular. Rumors, for example, Fleetwood Mac, which comes years later, but that's all, interpersonal dynamics and things, right? So I think music becomes much more personal in a way.
Yeah. And there's some rejection of the commune hippie collectivist
right
ideal, right? Or, whatever flavor you get out of that. And it really did directly kind of flip into individualism. And then, that really gets crystallized when we get into the 80s. But there's really cynicism away from like collective group action.
Right.
Like I'm in my own head, and I need to be better for me. And, I think, it's just the pendulum swung really the other way. And it is interesting, like Altamont is really kind of pointed to that. And that's 2 years prior to, the year music changed everything.
Right. But maybe to that point, even though I'm critical of that, being too specific in that frame, but it does seem to be an inflection point. Like you were saying, it really doesn't feel like, we were just talking about this previously, before we started recording, we talked about the fact that like, is something a 70s record or an 80s record? We were talking about that as, a decade dividing. And to that point, maybe 71 is the beginning of that, because it is the end of that like hippie movement. And like you said, politics becomes about individual freedoms, right? And as a matter of fact, then you also see something else happen that in the same regard, where it's like a backlash against not only the politics of that 60s flower power type movement, but it becomes about, like Led Zeppelin, for example, and other rock bands too. It becomes about being overtly over the top. Like it's kind of like you're fully embracing the hedonism of, I'm rich, I'm famous, I'm going to have fun. And like you said, it becomes, whether it's personal, whether you're Joni Mitchell talking about your own biography in your songs, or whether you're these artists that are going to be like, I'm going to be as big and as famous as possible, and I'm going to live it up, right? It's all about like me, right? It's the me generation, right? So
yeah, and the even though they seem really different, in my opinion, like to the listener, it both feeds a real sense of escapism, and you're not dealing, so you can go into the kind of biographical poetry of Joni Mitchell and apply that to your own life, or you can escape to being, a dancing king on the mountaintop.
Right. Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, like T-Rex, like glamour.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, even though one's like super extroverted and one's super introverted, it really did both. They both like just serve like kind of an escapist point rather than more, like topical songs and like protest music that was, I think, more palatable, or it reached a little further into the mainstream a decade ago.
And to your point, prog rock emerges here too. You have like Metal by Pink Floyd comes out, and that's really like where they establish their future sound, the sound that makes them like massively popular, versus their kind of psychedelic, almost twee, like the psychedelic pop, or no, I guess it would be almost like psychedelic folk, right, from those early records. And they become much bigger. And you have like Yes puts out their Fragile, which is very important. But to that point, like you were saying before, it almost becomes like science fiction now, right? These songs are no longer about, I mean, I guess they are. I mean, like, Yes is still talking about, personal, but once again, it is, internal, right? Like, I seen all good people, like I'll be around about, or I seen all good people turn away, right? Like it still is, their politics is still very internal, right? So.
Yeah. And, even the allegories are more, self, I don't know. It's from the first person perspective rather than, kind of a macro perspective.
So that all being said, how do you think, and does he fit into this at all? How does Bowie fit into this, right? Because Bowie is going to emerge 71, 72 between Hunky Dory and then Ziggy Stardust, right? He is going to emerge as like the Bowie that is going to be so influential, for maybe the most influential artist of the 70s. And he's going to ride many different trends throughout the 70s. But how does he fit into this? Because, here is someone who is experimenting with these different genres, but he's right. Like he is literally inventing personas and then inhabiting those personas, right? So, which is not at all in vogue at the time, right?
Yeah. And the thing that is kind of interesting there too, like they touch on in the first episode, it's he's touring in support of, The Man Who Sold the World, that record. Which was released the year prior, and that's Hunky Dory. And there's, the contrast there is kind of just what I was kind of getting at, where Hunky Dory is kind of it's in the same vein of more like personalized, smaller stories.
Right.
Kind of has that singer-songwriter quality to it, and then it doesn't really kind of light the world on fire,
right?
He basically goes completely the extroverted route with Ziggy Stardust,
right?
So it's basically, you can see how it's just more or less like shifting the energy from inward to outward.
I guess in a way, I guess you're right. In a way, it still is kind of self-centered, not in a negative way, and not that sounds as negative as it is. Because to your point, it still isn't like he might be metaphorically talking about certain political things, but you're right. It's like there's no longer us talking about war or something like that. He's, even though he's like inventing fantasies, right? And it starts even before then. You're right that he still is, started off like almost as a folk singer, but what is it, 68, right? It's 68 when he does Space Oddity, right? So he's already flying out to space, before the moon landing, right? Because that record flopped, and then it became a hit when we actually went to the moon, right? But yeah, so Bowie's already kind of experimenting with that, and maybe he got rewarded for, kind of going in a weird direction, right? Like doing like an homage to 2001: A Space Odyssey, basically, and then it turns into a hit, right? So then he starts going even more in that direction, right?
Yeah, he always was very kind of literary, I think, in his songwriting and not directly autobiographical.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, it goes from kind of like the quiet, uh, Major Tom. Space Odyssey is basically an acoustic guitar and
Yeah.
Mellotron. It's not that blown out. And it was kind of considered a novelty at first.
Yeah, absolutely. He was like considered like a one-hit wonder, and then he kind of really changed his whole career around.
Yeah, and it went from kind of going down the coffee house, I'm going to be a folk singer road, that wound up dying with the 60s.
Yeah.
And then he reemerges in the early 70s with, Ziggy Stardust, and that's basically what kind of launched him as a worldwide character.
But then his story, it's so weird because some of his earlier songs, like for example, like Life on Mars is, I think it's one of the best selling singles in the history of the UK, like one of their biggest hits, and definitely one of his biggest hits, but it's charted, I don't know, like 20 times over the career, over Bowie's career. And I think right after he died, it jumped back into the top 10 again, right? So it's been this massively successful song, but that was not a hit when it came out. It came out like, after he becomes a star, they kind of reissue his earlier singles, and then those become hits as well. So it's just interesting how his career went. How's that?
They shuffled him back up the board once he had some selling. They reissued stuff,
which is how it always used to be, by the way. So it's very funny when I look at someone's, just randomly when I look at some of these artists, I look at the discographies, and you'll see like even Al Green, for example, like when Tired of Being Alone took off, and I think I was his first number one. It might have been a number one. I think it's definitely his first number one. And he had a bunch of like modestly successful R&B songs, but none of them had like even cracked the top 40, I don't think, until he has Tired of Being Alone this very year that we're talking about, 1971.
I'm so tired of being alone. I'm so tired of on my own. Won't you help me, girl, just as soon as you can? People say that I found a way to make you say that you love.
And then, which then becomes kind of a formula for him. That's really becomes his sound for the next few albums. But then they reissued a bunch of his earlier songs, and some of them jumped up the charts, right? So it's kind of like a normal staple that when someone breaks, you try to get all their other stuff back up on the charts again, right?
Yeah, and the thing is, it's like that seems strange now because there's no time to pause to consider, okay, we got to press another, how many records we're going to invest in. There's no physical inventory involved, really.
Right.
Everyone's recording stuff digitally. You can instantly publish any amount of information, basically. So you wouldn't have that, and I don't know which is better. It's kind of interesting, being allowed to have a stream of conscious, like, oh, I made this song today, I'm going to put it out tomorrow.
Right.
Not have to, wait and coordinate and, marshal your resources. But then again, that's quality control.
Right.
Step in too. So it is interesting. But yeah, like, I don't know, Bowie and the whole glam thing.
Yeah.
Which it's funny because he was only really, he killed off Stardust.
Yep.
Made his next album Aladdin Sane, and that was basically it. And then it was on to a different kind of character.
Yeah, I mean, we could probably do a digression on glam at some later point, but I do find that funny that he like survived glam. He was smart to kill off Ziggy, as huge as it was, because it's kind of like glam doesn't last, right? It kind of fades away. And T-Rex, unfortunately, what's his name, dies, right? And that kind of ends to, and that was what an interesting artist he was. And by the way, going back to like making connections to all our previous episodes, I hadn't at the time made this connection until I started to re-examine T-Rex as an artist. But talk about influences on Prince, right? You talk about like some of these other artists, right? But you have this someone who's notoriously a womanizer, someone who's very small, like Prince, right? Someone who's like a guitar virtuoso, right? And a very weird, and as a very innovative musician, but very strange. Like, some of these early records are like all fantasy, like lyrics and stuff, right? Very weird stuff until. And
again, like that goes, they also exist on that 60s, end of the 60s, early 70s axis. So the original Tyrannosaurus Rex,
Yeah.
Mark Bolan on
Yep.
acoustic guitar, and some dude named I think he took the name Mickey Finn, which is kind of like a play on a like a Hobbit name, the Finn clan of Hobbitshire or whatever. But yeah, they're doing like, you know, total like fairy tale music, hippy dippy crap.
Right.
And then the 70s hit and things get a little more electric. And yeah, he's playing like old Chuck Berry riffs and singing about Cadillacs again. You know?
Yeah.
My babe, because you're my love. Oh, girl, I'm just a jeepster for your love.
And he loved to drive cars. That's what killed him, right? So,
Too soon.
but let's play some actual music for each other. So tell me something that you discovered either through the documentary or on your own that was either like a rediscovery for you, like something you haven't heard in a while that you're like, oh man, I forgot how much I love this song, or maybe something new that you discovered for the first time.
Okay, so yeah, the one of the first things that are introduced, one of the first songs introduced in the first episode is Ohio by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, which you pointed out wasn't actually released in 1971. But what was released in 1971 is an album by the Isley Brothers called Giving It Back, which is all covers. So that's a gold mine for me. But they do a medley of Ohio and the song Machine Gun, which I think Jimi Hendrix may have been the original singer on Machine Gun. They also cover I've Seen Fire and I've Seen Rain.
James Taylor.
So yeah, I'll play a little bit of the start of this.
I haven't heard Discovered before, by the way.
Can't you see the soldiers? I seen them marching. Whole lot of soldiers. I seen them marching. Summer day. I seen 10 soldiers, I hear them coming. We're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming. 4 dead in Ohio. 4 dead in Ohio. 4 dead in Ohio. 4 dead in Ohio. 4 dead, yeah. Gotta get down to it. Soldiers are cutting us down, y'all. Should have been done long ago. Well, what if you knew that girl found up dead on the ground? How could you run when you know? When you know? I'm just you, I seen gun. I seen gun.
I like how they mixed the Machine Gun, kind of guitar attack over the same, like the same rhythm line of Ohio. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Wow, I hadn't heard that before. Wow, I gotta, and this is Isley Brothers are somebody that I never really dig into, and every time I hear something by the Isley Brothers or even when they just like,
They're so underrated and
yeah,
not given enough props. I mean, because everyone knows that. Again, it's almost like a Nilsson thing where like everyone's heard Isley Brothers songs.
right,
Shout.
yeah, right. This doesn't sound anything like Shouts, that's for sure. But I mean, Ron, right? Ron, is that the lead singer, Ron Isley?
Yeah.
Because I've seen him, like, he still has recorded, in the past decade or so. You've heard him a guest on, rapping, rappers, songs, and with the Gorillas and stuff like that. And he always has such an incredible, soulful performance. Even now, it's a great voice.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have not given their earlier stuff enough of a listen for sure.
I have literally like a single that just came out like 2 months ago.
Yeah, yeah, still
I
doing
think on it, but it's him and Ernie. I think they're the only two left.
And this is something that they're going to talk about in this documentary. For anybody out there who wants to catch up on that, it's on Apple Plus, and we do recommend it. Very interesting. And I think already in episode 2, they start talking about how the drug problem that a lot of these folks got into, right? And unfortunately, it's great they see, you see the Isley Brothers or the surviving members of them, that they're still performing 50 years later, when tragically, you have within a few years, you have Jimi Hendrix is going to die, and Jim Morrison is going to die, and Janis Joplin is going to die, and Mama Cass is going to die, and and the list just goes on. And it's really crazy that all these people in their 20s and 30s are at the peak of their creative talents, and then they're all going to die in a very few years. So it's and unfortunately, once again, how history just keeps repeating itself. You look at just the past year. Not only do we go back and look at Tom Petty and Prince dying, which we've talked about in one of these episodes earlier, dying of drug overdoses, but you just look in the past year where some of these some of these up and coming rap stars have all died in the past 2-3 years, and it's pretty sad when you think about that.
Yeah, and going before that, it's Chris Cornell, but then earlier grunge guys like Lane Staley and Kurt Cobain, and no, it's tragic that is a motif that keeps repeating in life and art.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, in some cases, you look at Cobain's history, and you look at, and if I'm just throwing recommendations out there is a Cobain documentary that's very impressionistic. It kind of reads his diaries, like kind of things he wrote when he was younger, like in high school. Some of it are lyrics that will turn up in his songs later on, but a lot of it is just him writing these little kind of poems and short stories. Montage of Heck. So yeah, I mean, I recommend that a lot. It's really interesting, and it that almost speaks to Montage of Heck, is kind of that it's this very impressionistic, and it is very troubling. There are scenes, by the way, in that movie that are trigger warning for anybody who has issues with this. You see them with their daughter, and they are obviously doing heroin, and they've recorded themselves high with basically in the same room with their daughter, who's sitting on the bed while they're doing this. And it's kind of shocking to see the way they were living their lives. But at the same time, to speak to this unfortunate pattern that we see over and over again. And like I was saying before, sometimes I think it's mental illness. He seemed to have mental illness, and other of these folks have mental illness issues. Chris Cornell, for example, and that was a suicide versus some of these drug overdoses. But unfortunately, some of this, I think, is this romanticization of this kind of lifestyle. So I think a lot of times artists kind of succumb to this idea that they need to have these type of lifestyles, let's say, and I think that kind of becomes a trap in and of itself.
Oh yeah, definitely. And like someone like Graham Parsons, who is pretty much doing his burrito solo career in Burrito Brothers at right around 1970, 71. And he died in 73. He was 26, and far too many people. There's that whole bohemian idea where people are just really pushing the limit on all that stuff, and that's kind of that seemed to me like Jim Morrison's kind of thing. It was like, I'm the new Dionysus,
Yeah, that was embracing that fully. If I was going to play something, this is just I'll play something more pop later, but I wanted to kind of have a crazy discovery when I was just doing some research of things that came out in 71. I was looking for more things that might have had some kind of cultural impact that I wasn't aware of. And I found a Japanese band called Flower Traveling Band. Have you ever heard of these guys?
Flower Traveling Band, vaguely familiar. I don't think I've. No, I don't think so. I'm thinking of like some Yellow Machine orchestra or something like that. But
So I had not heard of this band before, by the way, but this album came out in 71, apparently very influential to like Black Sabbath and other bands like that. So the band's called Flower Traveling Band, and the album is called Satori. And here's a one of the tracks from Satori. Yeah, so that's something I'd never heard before, but obviously very influential on metal, right? This is like Judas Priest before Judas Priest, right?
oh yeah, I could see. I can hear Glenn Danzig taking a liking to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Um, yeah, so I was looking for kind of like weird nuggets here. I can play something other strange stuff here, but I was going to play also just like kind of a discovery, not a discovery, but like a rediscovery of something that is not as out there. There's so many. I mean, there's so many really great songs. I'm going to pick something here. Here, I'm going to play this one because this is a song I obviously knew, but a song that probably most people don't know. And it's Working Class Hero by John Lennon.
They are telling you still. But first you must learn how to smile as you kill. If you want to be like the folks on the hill. A working class hero is something to be. A working class hero is something to be. If you want to be a hero, well, just follow me.
So that's an overt political song, right? That's really talking about the like silent majority kind of sending their youth off to war, right? But I mean, like I said, it's a song that I don't think gets covered that much. David Bowie, by the way, covers this song very well in his with that band he had with Adrian Belew. What was that band called? Tin Machine. They have a good cover of this.
Yeah. No, that's one of my favorite John Lennon solo songs too. And that's, it's interesting. It's kind of like a diametric of Imagine.
Yes.
Where Imagine's very prosaic and hopeful, and and it's in the title. And then this song is very literal.
Yeah, even he drops the F-bomb in there. I trimmed around that, but yeah, it's like, but yeah, he's like, he's not pulling any punches basically. And it's funny, that record came out at the end of 1970, and Imagine would come out towards the middle or late 1971. I think the single comes out in the summer, but I think the album comes out at the end of the year. But this album comes out, and basically, the Let It Be is still on the charts, right? Let It Be comes out in like March or April of 1970, and then this is like the first thing he drops after he leaves the Beatles. Is he's like, yeah, this is where he's at after he leaves the Beatles. So, which I guess everybody's kind of staking their claim, going back to the kind of going full circle back to the beginning of our conversation, but everybody's kind of drifting off in their specific way. John Lennon's kind of staking a claim. This is where he's going to be. He's overtly political, kind of confrontational. George Harrison's fully in full bloom as a, flower power guy. He has the this year, very importantly, has the concert for Bangladesh, right? Bangladesh. And so that's a very important event this year, right? And Ringo Starr is just making, it don't come easy. He's just making pop songs, and I think it's the first #1 that any Beatle has is that one, right? So he's successful at it. And then Paul McCartney and Linda McCartney are doing Ram, which I'm not a huge. For out of all the Beatles, Ringo is the type of guy, like, I'm like, you go get him. Congratulations, you're still putting songs on the chart. Good for you. I'm glad that he's just trying, right? McCartney, as talented a songwriter as he is, in general, his solo career has not impressed me. He's got, I mean, he has some good songs, but then again, he put out like 40 records, right? So of course he's going to have some good songs on there over the course of his career. But
yeah, and yeah, he reverts into kind of things that at least I don't particularly enjoy about Paul McCartney, which are like the overly like goopy, sentimental stuff and things like that. He'll always find a way to pepper that into a record that he makes.
and even like, I think this is a number one for him, is that Uncle Albert medley. And even that is so, I mean, he has other songs on this album that are better than that, but that's so corny, because it's like he's doing the same thing. He's doing a medley. He's like, doing all these different musical genres all at the same time. It's like, and it's not as good as the medley off of Abbey Road, right? So it's just like,
Yeah. He shows his hand
yeah.
continually.
So you want to play anything else? Any other tracks you want to track down here for you?
I was going to say another kind of artist that's that emerged in 1971 that's a little off the beaten path is Judy Sill. And she put out a self-titled record, I believe, and was basically, in the Laurel Canyon kind of scene, and amazing pianist and songwriter, and put out the song Jesus Was a Crossmaker, which is a really nice one.
All right.
Debut album.
And it's silver angels over the sea, please come down flying low for me. One time I trusted a stranger, 'cause I heard his sweet song, and it was gently enticing me, though there was something wrong. But when I turned, he was gone, blinding me. His song remains reminding me he's a bandit and a heartbreaker. Oh, but Jesus was a crossmaker. Sweet silver angels over the sea, please come down flying low for me.
What's interesting about her delivery, I knew nothing about this artist, another singer songwriter that's emerging in this time, but female, I should say, because there's a lot of these that are coming. This is kind of the maybe the first wave, second wave of feminist songwriters coming up and kind of claiming a stake, or at least riding that wave into popularity. But anyway, what I found very interesting about her delivery is it reminds me of Ben Folds.
Yeah.
I think that might be where he gets some of his I wouldn't be surprised if he's been influenced by her. I'd have to actually track that down, but yeah, interesting.
Yeah, no, she's great, and she only managed to put out, I think, this and another record in her lifetime. She was a very wild person, apparently, and there's other songs about UFOs and yeah, but it's all in this kind of Baroque style. It's, I don't know, it's pretty trippy. But Judy Sill, yeah, she was really kind of heralded, I guess, by I think she was David Geffen's first record label. I think he's the guy that signed her, and they were really kind of thinking she was going to be like this next great, like Joni Mitchell type.
Right.
But I think like she wasn't promoted in that way, or other stylistic things probably got in the way of that. But another very interesting artist that kind of was born out of the end of the 60s.
Interesting. She has an album in 2018. Was this like a greatest hits, or did she actually come out of retirement or something?
Oh, that's posthumous. I think she died in 76 or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I see she only had 73 and 71. That's her only other records. That's unfortunate. What did she die of? Do you know?
Heroin overdose, I think.
Oh my goodness. Yet again.
So again, it's riding the same wave that's in this first kind of few years of the 70s that seems to be taking a lot of folks over that were, flower power people before hard drugs took hold.
I played a couple songs. Do you want to play another one while I?
Yeah. So on that Isley Brothers record, Giving It Back, there's one song on there that wasn't a cover of theirs called Cold Baloney, which is a cool song. But the notable part about that is Bill Withers was playing guitar on it as well.
Huh.
In 1971, he released his record Just As I Am.
Right, there's a huge hit on it.
Yeah, and here's that one.
Ain't no sunshine when she's gone. It's not warm when she's away. Ain't no sunshine when she's gone, and she's always gone too long. Anytime she goes away, wonder this time where she's gone. Wonder if she's going to stay.
Yeah, it's a great one. I love that song, by the way. I absolutely love that song. And I have to hear that record. I heard the album itself is actually good. So I need to, and like, unfortunately, like a lot of these things, it's stuff that you hear that one song and it, like only that one thing kind of, is the tip of the iceberg, but it also is that one thing that kind of survives, right, on the radio. And that's another thing I was kind of exploring today not out of coincidence, actually, as part of this exploration, was I was just looking at the top 100 songs of 1971. And it's amazing that even songs that are very popular, like, for example, we already talked about this in a previous episode, in one of our covers episode, but the Bee Gees song was like, one of the biggest hits of the year, and it goes down the list. Maggie May, and that's what this is actually going to lead to my next track I'm going to play. But Maggie May by Rod Stewart, after disparaging him in the last episode, what a great record Every Picture Tells a Story is, and why to this day he's maybe one of the most biggest disappointments as an artist to me, because he had so much potential. And but that song, not only is it a great song, but that was the second biggest hit of the year in 1971. So it was very extremely popular. But not only does he put out that record, he was incredibly prolific at the beginning of his career, he's also still putting music out with the Faces. And this song, Stay With Me, is also from 1971. Yeah, so awesome. Yeah, that's a great one. And but Every Picture Tells a Story, by the way, that's a great song, as is, Maggie May and Mandolin Wind, and Reason to Believe, by the way, right?
To believe someone like you makes it hard to live without somebody else, someone like.
But yeah, this is a really strong record, and pretty much nothing else he put out after that was as good.
Like we touched on before, it's just like he had a golden voice, and like he had a great band for such a small window of his career, and then
I mean, and once again, I don't know his biography, but I'm pretty sure those folks would have continued to make music with him, considering how massively successful he was. And I just feel like he just drifted into other stuff, and none of it was very interesting to me. And it just got worse and worse, by the way. It's not even like he pivoted into, Do You Think I'm Sexy or something. and then he pivoted back. It's like he just, that Do You Think I'm Sexy is pretty interesting by his standards compared to, at least he's like experimenting with like disco or something. By the time he gets to like he's just doing like really boring ballads at the beginning of the 80s. It's just one terrible song after another.
So yeah, this is on the heels of Marvin Gaye kind of establishing artistic freedom at Motown. Stevie Wonder was like right after him on that, and kind of concurrent, you can probably say. But this is one of my favorite songs from his 1971's album Where I'm Coming From, called Do Yourself a Favor.
Isolated junkyard, letting out the garbage, eating through the core of life. Sweet fragrance irritates, in a sterile death awaits. Persecute your own self-pride. Suffocate the new high, write a thorny music cries. Dig a grave and step right in. Like a Judas paid the price, 30 pieces more right. His fire take cut you. Do yourself a favor. Educate your mind. Get yourself together. Hey, there ain't much time. Do yourself a favor.
So yeah, I mean, that's when you can tell his lyrics are definitely getting more. They're going away from like simple love songs and more of the pop stuff that really Motown was really famous for.
And he's really important to funk too. Is that, I think, right? Is that Kool and the Gang actually have a really maybe proto disco, definitely proto funk record that came out in 70. I don't know if it would qualify in the 71 list, but and then of course you have like Shaft. But you think about he's ahead of the curve with what is going to qualify as funk. I mean, you look at Parliament, right? Parliament is not funkadelic yet because they are not funky yet, but they are. But funk is coming, and Stevie Wonder is very, very important to that. And you hear a lot of it right there in there, right? With the keyboard is going to be key. Yeah. Now, unfortunately, rock and roll music is very sexist, and women did not emerge until really right about now. So, and in general, and I gravitate to also, by the way, mostly male performers. So maybe on the next episode, we can kind of talk about singer-songwriters, and we'll focus on women. You also have Leonard Cohen and Nick Drake and Cat Stevens. So there's definitely going to probably be overlap with male performers as well when we go into that with the next one. But we should also focus on the ladies, because the ladies finally get to have their moment in the sun here in the late 60s, early 70s. And I'm going to wrap it up with Joni Mitchell, because Blue, by the way, I think it's the 50th anniversary of Blue this very week, right?
Yeah.
So so Joni Mitchell, right? And this is maybe not the most well-known song off this album, but it is definitely a very well-known song off this album, and maybe my favorite Joni Mitchell song, and it's River. Like a little Christmas carol here at the beginning.
It's coming on Christmas. They're cutting down trees. They're putting up reindeer and singing songs of joy and peace. Oh, I wish I had a river I could skate away on. But it don't snow here, it stays pretty green. I'm gonna make a lot of money, then I'm gonna quit this crazy scene. I wish I had a river I could skate away on. I wish I had a river so long I would teach my feet to fly. Oh, I wish I had a river I could skate away on.
Yeah, some real Hans Christian Andersen shit.
Right.
Her vocals make my hair stand up on my arms. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And
absolutely. Yeah.
Impeccable. Hunt. Can't
There-
say enough about Mitchell.
Yeah, I mean, her like you said, her vocals incredible, and her songwriting incredible also, right? We talked about this already before, but Prince, a huge Joni Mitchell fan, right? And it's all the things we talked about with him too, right? He's like, impeccable songwriting and incredible vocals. But he was a big Joni Mitchell fan. But beyond that, it's just like this just song. I didn't realize this, by the way. Trivia on Spotify, by the way, as I played this yesterday, that they have a little, now they have like visuals that play. Yeah. And they were basically talking about the story of this song. And apparently she was sick with, she was like in a, was it a polio ward? I forget. She was in some ward where she was isolated when she was younger. And this is her, she either wrote the song then, began writing it even as a younger girl, or she's reflecting on that, being trapped, at Christmas time inside of this like medical ward, right? So anyway, it's but going back to the theme of like this emergence of like the personal narrative as like maybe people used to look down on whether you would write something so personal as your material for a song. And like emerging here like in this year specifically, but probably even before so, but really clearly emerging here is these very personal narratives, right? And like I mentioned before, we see James Taylor, we see Joni Mitchell, we see Carly Simon, we see Carole King, we see Nick Drake, we see many, Leonard Cohen, right? Of course.
All time, what was he up to?
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, I guess he's this is just a year after
Broke up, right?
Yeah, the Sound of Silence, right? So I don't think he's put out his solo record, but it's coming soon. And he'll be influenced by this, although I guess they were always kind of interior monologues anyway, their music in general.
It's really interesting to kind of see that shift in popular approach, I guess.
Right.
So yeah, there was some big protest songs and mass in the leading up to the civil rights movement, and then it seemed that the civil rights movement got passed, but then things didn't really get all that much demonstrably better, and things seemed to descend into cynicism and kind of internalization.
It kind of surprises me in a way. Like I think I maybe never finished this point at the beginning, but I was talking about how some of these R&B artists didn't really, you hadn't really seen overt protest music. And the only protest music you kind of see, this kind of dissatisfaction, whether it is Gil Scott-Heron or whether it is What's Going On or What's to Come Later with Stevie Wonder and some of these other artists, that a lot of it is around the war rather than around the civil rights. And even like the civil rights anthems, whether it's R.E.S.P.E.C.T. or whether it's Sam Cooke's Change Is Going to Come, it had to almost be coded in the day. And it's kind of surprising because that it takes this long, because we're already years after the assassination of like, Martin Luther King, for example, and some of these other things. And speaking of that, even the assassination of John F. Kennedy, right? So it's surprising that, in other words, that the music isn't angrier than it is, right? Although it is getting dark, right? I actually have like a whole section here of music that is starting to get dark. Like, even when you hear Pink Floyd, with One of These Days, or you hear obviously Black Sabbath or Led Zeppelin at their darkest, that the music is getting darker too.
We'll talk about, there's a Riot going on by Sly Stone. That's the darkest one of their.
Oh yeah, and which is this year also.
One child grows up to be somebody that just loves to learn, and another child grows up to be somebody you just love to burn. Mom love.
let's not dance to the music anymore.
Right. Oh, and Maggot Brain too is pretty. The song, not the album necessarily in general, but that song, it goes into some pretty dark territory too, right?
Yeah, I think there's also March to the Witch's Castle is on that record. That's all about Vietnam.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's interesting because I don't know, maybe it seemed easier to galvanize against the war as a kind of external thing,
right,
rather than discussing more internal problems that are still happening either way. You know what I mean? So it's maybe more palatable to even just radio play.
And unfortunately, I hate to say it so bluntly, but I think, just given racism, that probably was that being anti-war got you a mainstream audience, whereas, being complaining about the civil rights movement got you a black audience, which is probably why Berry Gordy was afraid of what's going on coming out. And then maybe taking one of his biggest stars and potentially making him into a quote unquote black artist, right? And instead, no, it crossed over. It was massively successful, right? He has multiple songs off of there that are some of the biggest hits of the year.
Yeah, and even one other cool thing from this first episode, and again, this throws into contrast what we were just talking about, right? Of how activism changed and how it seemed people's focus culturally was more introverted rather than extroverted or cooperative. But Ali Frazier fight where
right,
he was a center, so you'd think he was like, at that night he seemed to be literally the punching bag for the American kind of center right or silent majority, and Joe Frazier was the guy that was knocking this draft dodging so and so out, and
that's actually a very interesting point, and they only talk about it briefly in the documentary, but you're absolutely right. And that is very fascinating, just to go into Ali. I mean, that's a much bigger topic, but to go into Ali's biography and see exactly that, where he went from being, first of all, even though in retrospect they say they like to frame it as he ruined his career by changing his name, becoming a Muslim, and becoming a draft dodger, and basically saying my enemy is the white man, right? Like that's obviously alienated him from a white audience. But they were already trying to they were always looking for the great white hope. They were already looking for white boxers to usurp him, right? So it's not like he had that many white fans. Anyway, they were there waiting. They were tuning in every single time, waiting to see him get knocked down is what they wanted. But he was such a great entertainer, right, that he won them over. And even more so, right, throughout the 70s, as the war became more unpopular, incredibly savvy, by the way, an incredibly savvy showman, that he was able to alienate people. It's like almost like, I feel like all the scripting that was done for wrestling in the 1990s and stuff was all based around that, right? You start off as a bad guy, you become the good guy, right? It's like it's all just like the template that Ali set. But that was him living his life, him trying to survive. But like I said, he was able to turn the hatred of him made him incredibly rich, and then he won them over. He won these people who hated him. Incredible turnaround when you think about him in the 80s being so beloved, right?
Beyond whatever media that got him initially famous.
Yeah. And yeah, he literally took people who despised him 10, 15 years earlier and turned them into his biggest fans. It's a pretty amazing turnaround. All right, so this is a very interesting time in history, as we've already touched on. It's so much to talk about. We could literally spin off just the Ali Frazier fights and the Rumble in the Jungle. Just that could be its own episode, and the music around that too, by the way, right? So there's there's a whole concert and everything. So and speaking of something to track down for you, possibly you might be interested in, is Questlove made it's his first movie. Have you seen this?
Oh, The Summer of Soul.
Yes. So it's a documentary that just came out this week, right?
Yeah.
So we should look at that, right? It happened, kind of this forgotten concert where hundreds of thousands of people showed up, taking place almost at exactly the same time as Woodstock, right? And so that's something to track down and investigate also. And maybe we could talk a little bit about that in the next episode too.
We want to do recommendations on stuff.
Yeah.
Apropos to this is that documentary, The U.S. versus John Lennon.
Yep.
All about his battles with Nixon and them trying to deport him and all because of anti-war activities and supposedly seditious behavior or something.
And if we're doing recommendations, I just have to pull it up here because there is a movie you can watch for free on Amazon Prime called David Bowie, The Sacred Triangle. And it's, yeah, so it's called, the whole title, it's a very long title, is David Bowie, The Sacred Triangle, Bowie, Iggy, and Lou, 1971 to 1973. And it basically, the basic frame of it is saying what you were talking about, Bowie being seen as this oddball who was a one-hit wonder that lucked out and had this one huge hit. And he was kind of like in the wild, experimenting, like he's doing a folk record. He's cross-dressing on the cover of The Man Who Sold the World. Man Who Sold the World, by the way, great song, right? Great song. But, he's all over the place with these, experiments, and how he kind of, became friendly with Iggy Pop, actually produced some of his music coming up right after he falls out with his record label. And of course, Lou Reed is just leaving the Velvet Underground and going solo. And he's going to have a big hit in a couple of years, right after 71. And it's not a great documentary, but the music's very interesting. And it's one of those documentaries where the content's good. The documentary itself's not awesome, but the some of the insight is interesting. Some of the old footage is interesting, right? So
yeah, because Bowie produced Perfect Day, that Lou Reed record, and Transformer, I guess it was called, or whatever.
Transformer, and then he also remixed the Third Stooges album, and also produced they went to Berlin together, right, to try to get Iggy to kick his heroin habit, right? So so it's so there was this, like you said, there's a synergy that forms there, and it's very important to the rest of the decade, right? So
yeah, cool, man, this is fun.
Yeah, awesome.
Let's call